After her mother's death, Sophie Anderson grapples with grief in rain-soaked Portland, only to discover a shocking family secret. The man who tried to exploit her vulnerability is her long-lost father. Can she navigate this unfamiliar connection and find the strength to rebuild her life? The rain fell like tears from heaven that autumn afternoon in Portland. A yellow taxi pulled up to an old, weathered apartment building on Morrison Street, the kind of building that had seen better days, with its faded brick walls and broken elevator that never seemed to work. From the back seat, a young woman stepped out into the cold drizzle. She wore all black, a simple dress, a thin coat, dark stockings. Her name was Sophie Anderson, and she had just buried her mother. Sophie was only 22 years old, but grief had a way of making people look older, don't you think? The shadows under her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, these were the marks of someone who had lost everything. She paid the taxi driver without really seeing him, without hearing his mumbled condolences. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, lost in that fog that settles over your soul when the person you love most in this world is suddenly, impossibly gone. The elevator was broken again, so Sophie climbed 3 flights of stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if her legs were made of lead. When she finally reached apartment 3B and turned the key in the lock, she wasn't ready for what waited on the other side of that door. Everything was exactly as her mother had left it. There, on the coat rack in the tiny entryway, hung her mother's favorite navy blue jacket, the one she wore almost every day when the weather turned cool. Next to it was the leather handbag she had saved for months to buy, treating herself to one small luxury after years of having nothing. And there, on the floor, sat a pair of boots. New boots. Boots her mother had purchased just 2 weeks before the illness took that terrible sudden turn for the worse. At the funeral, Sophie had been so strong. She had greeted people with quiet dignity. She had accepted their condolences with polite nods. She had stood by the graveside without shedding a single tear, determined to honor her mother with strength and grace. But now, alone in this apartment that suddenly felt too empty, too quiet, too full of memories, now the dam finally broke. Sophie collapsed onto the worn sofa and wept. She cried for her mother, for all the conversations they would never have, for all the future moments they would never share. She cried for herself, for the crushing loneliness that wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. The tears came in waves, each one more intense than the last, until exhaustion finally claimed her sometime after midnight. When morning came, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains. For one blessed moment, when Sophie first opened her eyes, she forgot what had happened. Then reality crashed over her like a cold wave, and she had to force herself not to cry again. Instead, she sat up and made herself think clearly about her situation. The truth was harsh and undeniable. She was alone, completely alone. Her mother, Elizabeth, had been her only family for the past 10 years. Sophie's father, the man she had called dead, the man named Thomas Anderson, had died when she was just 12 years old. A sudden heart attack, the doctor said. One moment he was there, and the next moment he was gone, leaving behind a widow and a daughter who had depended on him for everything. Those early years after his death had been the hardest time of their lives. Elizabeth had been only 35 years old when she became a widow, and she had never worked a real job before. She had married young, spent her entire adult life as a wife and mother. No college education, no professional training, no work experience. Her whole world had revolved around managing the household and caring for her family. But when Thomas died, Elizabeth had to reinvent herself. The life insurance barely covered the funeral and a few months of rent. She needed work, and she needed it fast. So she took whatever she could find, a position at a textile factory on the outskirts of Portland, hard, physical labor on an assembly line for barely more than minimum wage. But one job wasn't enough. Elizabeth wanted more for her daughter. She was determined that Sophie would not repeat her mistakes, would not find herself at 35 with no education and no options. So Elizabeth took on more work. She cleaned offices in the evenings. She worked retail on weekends. She took in ironing and mending from neighbors. She was always exhausted, always stressed, but she never complained. Every extra dollar went toward one goal, giving Sophie the best education possible. She hired tutors to help Sophie excel in school. She bought textbooks and supplies. She made sure Sophie could participate in activities that would help her succeed. And when Sophie earned a place at Portland State University, Elizabeth had been so proud. It felt like validation, like proof that all those sacrifices had been worth it. But the cost had been enormous. Elizabeth worked herself to the bone. She went without new clothes for years. She skipped meals to make sure Sophie had enough to eat. She worked when she was sick, ignoring warning signs her body was sending. And now she was gone, and Sophie was left to face the consequences of that single-minded devotion. Elizabeth had died without leaving any money behind. No savings account, no investments, no property. After paying for the funeral, Sophie had almost nothing left. Sitting at the kitchen table that morning, Sophie forced herself to face reality. She was in her third year at Portland State, studying business administration. She had been a good student with a solid GPA, but none of that mattered now. Without her mother's income, she couldn't pay rent, couldn't buy food, couldn't cover basic expenses, let alone continue her education. She needed a job. Immediately. Her studies would have to wait. The next morning, Sophie went to the dean's office and submitted paperwork for a leave of absence. The administrative assistant, a kind woman with sympathetic eyes, processed everything quickly. Within an hour, Sophie had officially withdrawn from the semester. "You can return when things improve," the woman assured her. But Sophie wondered privately if that day would ever come. After leaving the administration building, Sophie walked across campus to meet her friend Rachel Martinez at the Student Center. Rachel was waiting at their usual table with 2 cups of coffee already purchased. When she saw Sophie, her face filled with a concern. The two young men embraced tightly before sitting down. "I submitted the paperwork," Sophie said quietly. "It's official. I'm taking time off." "That's probably the right decision," Rachel said carefully. "You need time to grieve, to figure things out." "I'm not taking time off to grieve," Sophie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm leaving because I have no choice. I need to work. I need to serene. I don't know if I'll ever be able to come back." Rachel squeezed her friend's hand. "Do you have any job prospects?" Sophie shook her head. "I've never really worked before. Mom always insisted I focus on school. She said education was my job." Her voice broke on those last words. Rachel was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then her expression brightened slightly. "Actually, I might be able to help. My boyfriend James works part-time as a security guard at a restaurant downtown, the Riverside Grill on Burnside Avenue. He mentioned a couple weeks ago that they're looking for wait staff. One of their servers quit suddenly." Sophie felt a spark of hope. "Really? James offered me the job first, but I turned it down because of classes. Let me call him right now and see if it's still available." Rachel stepped away to make the call, and Sophie watched through the window, her heart pounding with anticipation. After a few minutes, Rachel returned with good news. "The position is still open. James talked to the owner, and she's willing to interview you tomorrow morning at 9. Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. "Thank you, Rachel. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You're stronger than you think, Sophie. Your mom raised you to be a survivor." The next morning, Sophie dressed carefully in a simple black skirt and white blouse. She pulled her dark hair into a neat ponytail and applied minimal makeup. Looking in the mirror, she thought she looked older than a 22, the strain of recent weeks evident in every line of her face. The Riverside Grill was in one of Portland's trendier neighborhoods, a part of town Sophie rarely visited. The building was impressive, a renovated warehouse with large windows and elegant signage. Sophie arrived 15 minutes early, standing outside for a moment to gather her courage. At exactly 9 o'clock, she pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The interior took her breath away. Exposed brick walls, gleaming hardwood floors, tasteful artwork, tables set with crisp white linens and elegant place settings, crystal chandeliers hanging from high ceilings. This was unlike any place Sophie had ever been. "Can I help you?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. Sophie turned to see a tall, elegant woman approaching. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in an expensive pantsuit. Her blonde hair was styled in a sleek bob, and everything about her radiated authority and sophistication. "I'm Sophie Anderson," Sophie said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have an interview appointment." "I'm Christine Dubois. I own this restaurant." "Follow me." Sophie followed Christine to a small office at the back. The office was as elegant as the rest of the space. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, tasteful decorations. Christine gestured for Sophie to sit, then settled into her own chair behind the desk. For a long moment, Christine simply looked at Sophie with a cool, assessing gaze. Sophie fought the urge to squirm, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "James tells me you're looking for work as a server," Christine said finally, her voice crisp and professional. "Do you have any experience in food service?" "Not in a restaurant," Sophie admitted, "but I'm a fast learner and willing to work hard. I've had customer service experience from working at the library." Christine raised an eyebrow. "You're a university student? Why are you looking for full-time work?" Sophie hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I've taken a leave of absence from school," she said quietly. "My mother passed away recently, and I need to work to support myself. I plan to return to university eventually, but right now I need a job." Christine's expression softened slightly, just a fraction. "I see. I'm sorry for your loss." She paused, then continued in her businesslike tone. "This position is demanding. High-end establishment, long hours, physically tiring work. Can you handle that?" "Yes," Sophie said firmly. "Absolutely." Christine studied her for another moment, then nodded slowly. "Your lack of experience is a disadvantage. Normally, I wouldn't consider someone with no restaurant background. However, you're well-spoken, presentable, and motivated. I'll offer you a probationary period, 2 weeks. If you perform well, I'll keep you permanently." Sophie felt a surge of relief and excitement. "Thank you. I won't let you down." "Your first shift is tomorrow at 11. Arrive 30 minutes early. The other servers will train you. Pay attention, ask questions, and don't be afraid to admit when you don't know something." Christine's expression became stern. "This job requires reliability, attention to detail, and excellent customer service. If you can't meet those standards, we'll part ways without hard feelings. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear," Sophie said. "Thank you for this opportunity." That evening, as Sophie prepared for bed, she found herself talking quietly to her mother as if Elizabeth could somehow hear her. "I got a job, Mom," she whispered into the darkness. "It's at a really nice restaurant. The owner is tough, but she gave me a chance. I hope I can make you proud. I'm going to work as hard as you always did. I promise I'll make something of myself just like you wanted." She fell asleep that night with tears on her cheeks, but also with hope in her heart for the first time in weeks. Sophie's first days at the Riverside Grill passed in a blur of information and exhaustion. She arrived early every day, stayed late, and absorbed everything like a sponge. A server named Hannah Chen took her under her wing, teaching her how to greet customers, take orders, time the delivery of courses, and manage multiple tables at once. The menu was sophisticated, full of dishes Sophie had never heard of before. The wine list alone was 30 pages long. "Don't worry too much about the wine," Hannah advised during a quiet moment. "We have a sommelier for the detailed questions. Just learn the basics." By the end of her first week, Sophie was serving her own tables. She discovered she was naturally good at the interpersonal side of things, friendly without being too familiar, attentive without being intrusive. The other staff members were generally welcoming, though she could sense some reservations from the servers who had been there longer. She would have to prove herself first. One server in particular became a friend. Her name was Jennifer Wright, about 25 years old, with a warm personality and genuine kindness. "You're doing really well for someone with no experience," Jennifer told her one evening. "Most people are a mess for weeks, but you've picked things up quickly." "Thank you," Sophie said, grateful for the encouragement. "I really need this job to work out." "Christine can be tough," Jennifer said, lowering her voice. "But she's fair. Just be careful about the regular customers, especially the wealthy ones. Christine is very protective of them, and some of them can be difficult." Before Sophie could ask what she meant, the dinner guests started arriving and they had to get back to work. It was during Sophie's second week that everything changed. She was serving a table of businesswomen when she heard a commotion near the entrance. The doorman had rushed to open the door with unusual haste. Sophie glanced over to see what warranted such attention. A man was entering the restaurant, and everything about him screamed wealth and power. He appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s, tall and well-built, with dark hair graying at the temples. He wore an expensive suit, perfectly tailored, and moved with the easy confidence of someone used to being the most important person in any room. But what struck Sophie most was Christine's reaction. The restaurant owner, who normally maintained a cool professional demeanor with everyone, had emerged from her office and was greeting this man with enthusiasm that bordered on flirtation. She was smiling broadly, something Sophie rarely saw, and her entire body language had changed, becoming animated and almost girlish. "Who is that?" Sophie whispered to Jennifer as they passed near the kitchen. Jennifer followed her gaze, and her expression became serious. "That's Michael Bradford. He's a regular here, comes in once or twice a week. Some kind of real estate developer. Very wealthy. Always leaves huge tips." "Christine certainly seems happy to see him," Sophie observed. Jennifer laughed softly, though there was an edge to it. "Christine has been trying to land him for years. Everyone knows she's interested, but he's never taken the bait. He's a confirmed bachelor." She paused, then added in a lower voice, "Listen, Sophie, I need to warn you about something. Be careful around Michael Bradford." Sophie looked at her friend with surprise. "Why?" "He has a reputation," Jennifer said carefully. "He likes young women, especially women of color. And Christine is incredibly jealous about it. The last server who worked here, the one whose position you filled, she was let go because Michael showed interest in her. Christine found an excuse to fire her, but we all knew the real reason." Sophie felt a cold sensation in her stomach. "That's horrible. Just keep your distance," Jennifer said. "Be professional, but don't engage in personal conversation. Trust me, it's not worth losing your job over." Sophie nodded and returned to her tables, but she couldn't help glancing occasionally toward where Michael Bradford sat. He was alone at a prime table near the window, and Christine had personally taken his order. The woman was practically glowing as she spoke with him. About an hour later, Christine approached Sophie with an expression that was hard to read. "Sophie, I need you to take over service for Mr. Bradford's table. He's requested additional items, and I need to attend to business in the office." Sophie felt anxiety flutter in her chest but nodded professionally. She collected her notepad and made her way to Michael Bradford's table, mentally preparing to be polite but distant. "Good evening, sir," she said with a professional smile. "I understand you'd like to order something additional?" Michael Bradford looked up at her, and Sophie saw his eyes widen. He stared at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't interpret. Surprise? Recognition? Something else she couldn't identify. The intensity of that gaze made her deeply uncomfortable. "Yes," he said finally, though his voice sounded distracted. "I'll have another glass of the Cabernet and the chocolate soufflé for dessert." "Excellent choice," Sophie said, noting the order. "The soufflé will take about 20 minutes. Can I bring you anything else while you wait?" "What's your name?" Michael asked abruptly. Sophie hesitated, remembering Jennifer's warning, but it seemed rude not to answer. "Sophie," she said simply. "Sophie," he repeated, still studying her face with that unsettling intensity. "You're new here. I haven't seen you before." "I started 2 weeks ago," Sophie confirmed, keeping her tone polite but not inviting further conversation. "I'll put your order in right away." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "You remind me of someone." Sophie didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded politely and walked away, her heart beating faster than normal. There had been something disturbing about the way he looked at her, an intensity that went beyond normal customer interest. For the rest of the evening, she avoided his table. She was relieved when he finally left the restaurant about an hour later. "How did it go?" Jennifer asked as they cleaned up after closing. "It was fine," Sophie said, though she still felt unsettled. "He was polite enough, but you were right. There was something about the way he looked at me that was uncomfortable." "Just remember what I told you," Jennifer said seriously. "Keep your distance." But keeping her distance from Michael Bradford proved impossible. Over the following weeks, he became a constant presence in Sophie's life. His visits to the restaurant increased 3 or 4 times a week now, and increasingly he requested to be seated in Sophie's section. "She's testing you," Jennifer said quietly one evening as they watched Christine lead Michael to one of Sophie's tables. "Christine is testing you. She needs an excuse to fire you. If she can catch you flirting with him, she has her justification." Sophie felt sick. That's insane. I haven't done anything to encourage him. I know, Jennifer said, but she's not rational when it comes to Michael Bradford. And Michael's attention only intensified. He engaged Sophie in conversation every time she came to his table. He asked about her day, her life, her interests. He commented on her appearance in ways that walked the line of inappropriate, calling her beautiful, asking if she had a boyfriend. Then came the invitations. The first one caught Sophie completely off guard. "Sophie, what time do you get off work tonight?" Michael asked after she delivered his entree. "I finish at 10, she said carefully. "Perfect. Why don't I pick you up after your shift? We can go for a drive, maybe get a drink. I'd love to get to know you better." Sophie felt her face flush. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bradford, but I can't. I need to go straight home. Thank you for the invitation." "Come on," Michael said, his smile widening. "Don't be shy. I'm very well known in Portland. Being seen with me might even be good for your career here. I could mention to Christine what an exceptional server you are." The implicit threat in those words made Sophie even more uncomfortable. "I appreciate the offer, but I really can't. Is there anything else I can get for you?" Michael studied her for a moment, then shook his head with apparent amusement. "No, that's all. But Sophie, I don't give up easily. I'll ask again." And he did, over and over. He offered to take her to exclusive restaurants. He suggested weekend getaways to the coast or his mountain vacation home. He mentioned his connections throughout the city, how he could help her career. Sometimes he came with beautiful women, models, socialites, always blonde and white, the opposite of Sophie's appearance. She suspected he brought them deliberately, trying to make her jealous. But it only reinforced her determination to keep him at arm's length. Sophie handled it all with consistent professionalism. She smiled politely, deflected his advances with humor when possible, and always maintained boundaries. In a strange way, it became almost like a game. He'd make outrageous offers, and she'd find creative ways to decline. "He offered me a trip to Bali today," she told Jennifer one evening, laughing despite herself. "Can you imagine? He said he has a villa there." Jennifer didn't laugh. "Sophie, this isn't funny anymore. He's escalating, and Christine is noticing. I've seen the way she watches you. She's getting angrier." "But I'm not doing anything wrong," Sophie protested. "What am I supposed to do? Be rude to him?" "I know you're in an impossible situation," Jennifer said. "Just be careful. I have a bad feeling about this." Despite the warnings, Sophie tried not to worry. She was doing her job well, earning good tips, even managing to save a little money each week. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt like she might survive on her own. But then everything fell apart. The day started like any other. Sophie arrived 30 minutes early, stored her belongings in the employee locker, and headed to the dining room to help with setup. She'd been working about 15 minutes when Christine appeared, her expression cold and hard. "Sophie," Christine said sharply, "I need to see you in my office." "Now." Sophie's heart began to pound, but she nodded and followed Christine to the back office. Once inside, Christine closed the door firmly and turned to face her with barely controlled anger. "Sit down," Christine commanded. Sophie sat, fear gripping her chest. Christine settled into her chair and fixed Sophie with a cold stare. "I'm very disappointed in you, Sophie. When I hired you, I thought you were in a difficult situation. I trusted you despite your lack of experience. And this is how you repay me? By stealing from us?" Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. "What? I haven't stolen anything." "We conducted an audit yesterday," Christine continued, her voice icy. "There's a shortage in the cash register, and we found most of the missing money in your locker." "That's impossible," Sophie said, her voice rising with panic. "I didn't take anything. I would never—" "I don't want to hear your excuses," Christine cut her off. "I'm not going to the police because I don't want the restaurant's reputation damaged. But you're fired. Get your things and leave. Now." Sophie felt tears streaming down her face. "Please, you have to believe me. I didn't do this. I don't know anything about any money." "Get out," Christine said coldly, "before I change my mind about calling the police." Sophie stumbled out of the office, grabbed her belongings from her locker, and fled the restaurant. She ran home through the streets, sobbing, humiliated, devastated. Back in her apartment, she collapsed on the couch, crying until she had no tears left. Eventually, through her grief and despair, she found herself reaching for an old photo album, her mother's album. She desperately wanted to feel close to Elizabeth, to remember better times. As she turned the pages looking at pictures of her mother smiling, an envelope suddenly slipped out and fell to the floor. Sophie picked it up with trembling hands. Her name was written on the front in her mother's handwriting. With shaking fingers, she opened the envelope and began to read. My sweet Sophie, if you're reading this letter, I'm probably not with you anymore. I'm sorry for not telling you sooner, but now that you're on your own, you need to know the truth. When I was 19, I was young and foolish. I left my fiancée just before our wedding after a terrible argument. I had no idea I was pregnant with you. Then I met Thomas, who raised you as his own daughter. He was a wonderful man who loved you completely, even knowing you weren't his biological child. But now you're an adult, and you have the right to know about your real father. His name is Michael. Michael Bradford. He's a well-known businessman in our town. I want you to know you're not alone in this world. When you face challenges, you can turn to your father. I hope he'll accept you. And please, ask him to forgive me. I know what I did to him was wrong, but I can't turn back time. I'm sorry. Sophie dropped the letter, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Michael Bradford, the man who had been propositioning her for weeks, making inappropriate advances, treating her like a conquest, was her father, her biological father. Why didn't you tell me earlier, Mom? Sophie whispered, staring at a photograph of her parents. Why? She felt sick, humiliated, horrified. Her own father had been hitting on her, talking about her appearance, inviting her to his villa. And he had no idea. She had no idea. Sophie decided she wouldn't tell him. She couldn't face that conversation. Instead, she would look for another job and try to forget this nightmare ever happened. But the next day, as Sophie returned from yet another unsuccessful job interview, she saw a familiar vehicle parked near her building, Michael Bradford's expensive SUV, and there he was, leaning against it, holding a bouquet of flowers. I went to the restaurant, he called out as she approached. I heard you're in trouble. You did wrong, but I can help you. Something inside Sophie snapped. All the pain, all the humiliation, all the horror of the past 24 hours came flooding out. She ripped the bouquet from his hands and threw it to the ground, stomping on it. I stole nothing, she screamed, tears streaming down her face. I did nothing wrong. My mom died first, and now my father wants to buy me. She ran through the building entrance, slamming the door behind her. Michael stood frozen, staring at the closed door. His mind raced. My mom died. My father wants to buy me. He waited 10 minutes at the bottom of the stairs, giving both of them time to calm down. Then he climbed to her floor and rang the doorbell. What do you want? Sophie's voice came from behind the closed door, thick with tears. Are you Mary's daughter? Michael asked quietly. His voice was shaking. Are you Elizabeth's daughter? There was a long pause, then, yes, I'm her daughter. I found a letter from my mom yesterday. She explained everything, the whole truth. Please, Michael said, his voice breaking. Please open the door. Let's talk. We need to talk. For a minute, Sophie didn't respond. Michael thought she would refuse, but then the door opened and Sophie stepped asking to let him enter. She went to the table, picked up her mother's letter, and silently handed it to him. Michael's hands trembled as he read Elizabeth's familiar handwriting, the woman he had loved and hated for decades, the woman who had broken his heart and shaped every relationship he'd had since. As he read her words, her confession, her explanation, her apology, tears began streaming down his face. It's so painful to realize she's gone, he said when he finished reading, that I'll never see her again. I dreamed so many times of meeting her again, of showing her what she gave up, of finally winning somehow. And now she's gone, and it all turns out like this. He looked at Sophie, his eyes red. I'm so sorry. You're my adult daughter, a daughter I never knew existed, who I never raised, and who I approached with such disgusting behavior. I promise you, I'll make this right. I'll fix everything. Sophie stood silently. She didn't know what to say. But in her heart, she knew this was her father, her real father, her own blood. And he wasn't a bad man, just someone wounded by life, made cynical by old pain. She realized in that moment that she wanted to do everything possible for them to become a family. It would just take time. Healing always takes time. "Let's have some tea," Sophie said quietly, tears still streaming down her face. Michael nodded, wiping his own eyes. They sat together at the small kitchen table, father and daughter, strangers brought together by tragedy and truth. Outside, the Portland rain continued to fall. But inside that modest apartment, something new was beginning. Two wounded souls connected by blood and loss were taking the first tentative steps toward redemption, toward forgiveness, toward family. Sometimes the truth breaks everything apart before it can put things back together. Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what we've been missing all along. And sometimes, even in our darkest moments, there's a cup of tea waiting, and someone to share it with who finally understands. This was just the beginning of their story, the beginning of healing, the beginning of becoming the family that fate and circumstance had denied them for so long.